It's Never Too Late: How George Built Purpose, Passion, and Prosperity After 60. George Miller had always believed that retirement was supposed to be the reward at the end of a lifetime of hard work, a quiet chapter filled with lazy mornings, warm cups of coffee, and afternoons spent watching the world go by. But when he finally left his job as a mid-level manager at a logistics company after 40 years, reality struck much harder than he expected. At 62, instead of peace and comfort, George found himself sitting at his kitchen table in his small Ohio townhome, surrounded by a sea of unpaid bills. Rising healthcare costs, creeping inflation, and property taxes had eaten away at his savings. The pension and Social Security he had always assumed would sustain him now looked painfully inadequate. Patricia, his wife of 35 years, tried to reassure him, placing a gentle hand over his trembling one. "We'll manage, George," she said softly. "We always do." But George wasn't so sure. For decades, he had been the provider, the dependable man who made sure his wife and two children never lacked anything. Now he was haunted by the idea that he might not be able to care for Patricia or even for himself. He felt betrayed. He had done everything right, yet here he was, weighing whether to fix the leaking roof or pay for his next doctor's appointment. After weeks of sleepless nights and anxious calculations, George made a decision that bruised his pride but soothed his fears. He would find part-time work. "Just something small," he told Patricia one evening. "A few hours a week." The following week, George walked into the local grocery store and filled out a job application. To his surprise, the manager hired him on the spot as a part-time stock clerk. The work wasn't glamorous, unloading boxes, stacking shelves, sweeping aisles, but it was honest. At first, George dreaded the idea of being seen by neighbors while pushing a cart of canned goods. But as the weeks passed, something unexpected happened. The job gave his days structure. His young coworkers, full of energy and teasing nicknames, reminded him how much he still had to offer. "Hey Pops," one of them said one afternoon, "can you give me some advice? I think I messed things up with my girlfriend." Another confessed that he saw George as the father figure he never had. Their words touched George deeply. For the first time in months, he felt useful again. But the paycheck was small, barely enough to cover groceries. George knew he needed more than shelf stocking if he wanted to build real financial security. Late at night, while Patricia slept, he scoured the internet for side income ideas. Most seemed unrealistic or outright scams. But one evening, he stumbled upon an online forum where retirees shared how they supplemented their income, from renting spare rooms to selling handmade crafts online. That night, George remembered an old passion: woodworking. In the back of his garage, buried under dust, were tools he hadn't touched in years. Decades earlier, he had built a pink birdhouse for his daughter Emily, who had proudly hung it in the backyard. Maybe, he thought, he could start there. The next weekend, George set up a workbench and built 3 simple birdhouses. His hands were clumsy at first, but soon the old muscle memory returned. When Patricia peeked into the garage and saw him working, she teased, planning to start a bird sanctuary. "Maybe a business," he replied with a grin. They decided to take the birdhouses to the local farmers market. George was nervous, convinced no one would buy them. But by the end of the day, they had sold everyone and even received a custom order. The earnings were modest, but the validation was priceless. George kept building. Patricia joined in, painting the houses in bright colors. Together, they became a team, laughing and working late into the evenings. Of course, not everything went smoothly. Selling online proved far more complicated than he expected. Poor photos, high shipping costs, and demanding customers tested his patience. A negative review nearly made him quit, but Patricia's gentle reminder, "It's not about being perfect, George, it's about trying," became his mantra. Soon, George found himself juggling multiple small jobs: grocery clerk, birdhouse maker, handyman for neighbors who needed fences repaired or walls patched. The physical work left him exhausted, but he began waking each morning with renewed purpose. People started recommending him to friends. "George is reliable," they said. "He cares." Slowly, his patchwork of small incomes created a new sense of stability. Still, George knew he couldn't rely on physical labor forever. His knees ached and his hands trembled after long days. Determined to diversify his income, he cautiously dipped into investing. He opened a small certificate of deposit, then bought dividend-paying stocks from established companies. The returns were tiny, but watching dividends trickle in filled him with a quiet thrill. Not every investment was a success. One guaranteed return scheme turned out to be a scam, costing him money and pride. "It's not about the loss," Patricia reminded him. "It's about how you recover." George learned to research more carefully, choosing safety over speculation. The birdhouse business, meanwhile, began to grow beyond their expectations. At the farmers' market, their booth became a local favorite. Then one Saturday, a shop owner approached George and offered to buy his birdhouses wholesale. The idea terrified him. Wholesale sounded far too ambitious, but Patricia whispered, "Say yes." He did. That decision transformed their hobby into a small business. George spent weeks building inventory while Patricia tracked orders and payments. Their children, Emily and Robert, were amused but proud. "Dad," Emily laughed, "you've become a startup founder at 63. As the business grew, George reduced his grocery store hours to focus more on birdhouses and investing. Patricia made sure they still had time for each other: picnics, movie nights, and weekend trips. "We're not just partners in work," she reminded him. "We're partners in life." A year after his initial financial panic, George felt like a different man. He was still working hard, but now he felt in control. One evening, he turned to Patricia and admitted, "I think I was more afraid of feeling useless than of running out of money." "No?" she asked. As the months rolled by, George's days grew fuller and richer. His birdhouse business became a staple of the local market, and his small investments ticked along steadily. But for the first time in years, he also started dreaming again, not about money, but about experiences. One evening over coffee, George asked Patricia, "Do you ever think about traveling, not just to see the kids, I mean really traveling?" "All the time," she admitted with a wistful smile, "but I didn't want to bring it up while you were stressed." George chuckled, "Funny thing is, the more I work, the more I realize we don't need as much as I thought. We could save a little and go somewhere." And so they started a small travel jar. George tucked away a few dollars from every birdhouse sale while Patricia contributed savings from grocery deals and gifts. It was slow but symbolic proof that they were moving beyond mere survival. Their efforts paid off. The following spring, they packed their old sedan and embarked on a road trip through the Appalachian Mountains. The rolling hills, fiery sunsets, and charming roadside diners felt like treasures. At one overlook, Patricia's eyes glistened with tears. "I didn't think we'd ever get here," she whispered. George wrapped his arm around her. The trip wasn't extravagant, but it was theirs, funded by their own hard work and resilience. It was a triumph. When they returned, George threw himself even deeper into his projects. He began designing seasonal birdhouses, pumpkin-shaped ones for fall, snow-covered cottages for winter. Customers loved the creativity and began asking when the next collection would appear. His handyman work also grew through word of mouth, though he learned to say no to jobs that were too demanding. It wasn't about chasing every dollar anymore. It was about balance. Yet aging made itself known. His hands sometimes cramped from arthritis and his back complained more often. Patricia noticed. "Promise me you'll listen to your body," she said gently. "We've come too far for you to hurt yourself." "I promise," George said, and he meant it. It was around this time that an unexpected idea took root. Over coffee with Kyle, a young neighbor struggling to find direction after college, George found himself offering advice not just about jobs but about persistence, resilience, and purpose. When they finished talking, Kyle said, "You should teach this stuff. People would pay to hear it." The thought lingered. George approached the local community center and offered to lead a free workshop on finding income after 60. The coordinator eagerly accepted. When the day came, George stood nervously before 24 retirees, his palms sweating. But once he started speaking, sharing stories of stocking groceries, building birdhouses, and learning to invest, his nerves faded. By the end, a woman approached him in tears. "I thought my life was over when I retired," she said, "but you've given me hope." That moment changed George. Teaching wasn't just another income stream, it was a calling. Over the next year, he led regular workshops, then lectures at libraries and church groups. The modest honorariums helped financially, but the real reward was watching others rediscover purpose. Patricia beamed with pride. "You found your second act," she told him. "Maybe my third," he laughed. Life wasn't without setbacks. A snowstorm once damaged their roof, costing thousands. In the past, such an expense would have sent George spiraling into anxiety. Now, he calmly dipped into their emergency fund and rebuilt it over the following months with extra handyman work and larger birdhouse orders. Each obstacle felt like a test he was now equipped to handle. By 65, George's story began to attract attention. The local newspaper ran a feature on his birdhouses and a radio station invited him to share his second act journey, but George remained humble. "I'm not a financial wizard," he told listeners. "I'm just a man who refused to stop trying." The business continued to grow. Customers lined up early at the farmer's market to buy his creations. One day, a woman asked if he sold online. He hadn't. Technology intimidated him, but the idea stuck. With help from his tech-savvy grandson Ethan, George launched an online store. Within weeks, orders were coming from across the country. Patricia included handwritten notes with each package, and customers responded with photos and thank you letters. Just as George was gaining confidence with this new chapter, life threw another challenge his way. Patricia began experiencing dizzy spells and fatigue. After several doctor visits, they learned she had a heart condition that required ongoing care and expensive medication. The bills piled up quickly, threatening the stability they had fought so hard to achieve. George felt fear creeping back into his chest, but Patricia reached for his hand. "Don't go backwards," she said. "We'll get through this together." And they did. George increased online production, introduced limited edition designs, accepted more speaking engagements, now charging small fees, and shifted some investments into safer, income-producing bonds. It wasn't easy, but it was enough to cover Patricia's care without sinking them into debt. Through it all, Patricia remained his partner, helping package orders on her good days and brainstorming new workshop ideas on her bad ones. George realized that every piece of work, every birdhouse, every lecture was more than just a way to make money. It was an act of love. Soon after, the community center director invited George to teach a 6-week course titled Earning with Dignity, Finding Income After Retirement. The program was a hit, drawing seniors from across the county. George shared not just financial tips but stories of resilience and creativity. At the final session, attendees gave him a standing ovation. "You've changed how I see retirement," one man told him. Even as his public role grew, George never lost touch with the simple joys that started it all. He still spent mornings in his garage, sawdust on his hands, shaping wood into something beautiful. Evenings were spent on the porch with Patricia, sipping tea and watching the sun set. "Retirement was supposed to be the end of everything," George said one night, "but it's become the start of something new." "That's because you refused to quit," Patricia replied. The following years brought new challenges and deeper rewards. A powerful storm swept through their town one summer, tearing shingles from rooftops and flooding basements. George's garage was mostly spared, but several birdhouses were damaged and his delivery schedule fell behind. The old George, the one from his early 60s, would have felt overwhelmed. But now he knew he didn't have to face setbacks alone. Ethan and his sister Lily spent weekends sanding and painting birdhouses to help him catch up. Neighbors offered scraps of wood to replace what had been ruined. Patricia, though limited by her health, organized orders and answered customer messages. What could have been a disaster became a reminder of something profound. Strength doesn't always mean standing alone. "We rise higher when we rise together," George told his next workshop audience. Word about his workshop spread, and demand grew beyond the small community center. They moved into a larger regional hall that could accommodate over 100 people. Seniors traveled from neighboring counties to hear him speak, not just for the financial advice, but for the hope and humanity woven into his words. One man in his 70s approached George after a lecture, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I thought retirement meant fatting away," he said, "but you showed me I can still create, I can still contribute." Moments like that became George's true reward. The money from workshops and birdhouse sales paid for Patricia's medication, home repairs, and small luxuries like trips with the grandchildren. But the deeper satisfaction came from knowing he had touched lives, from watching people walk out of his sessions standing a little taller, believing their futures still mattered. By 66, George was something of a local legend. The newspaper ran follow-up stories on his journey, and the radio invited him back for a special segment on second acts in retirement. He was nervous at the microphone, but his words resonated deeply. Listeners flooded the station with calls, sharing their own stories of renewal and purpose. Despite the attention, George never lost his humility. "I'm no expert," he always reminded people. "I just refuse to stop trying. The trick is not to focus on what you've lost but on what you can still give." At home, life was tender and full of gratitude. Patricia's health required regular checkups, but her spirit remained strong. For their 43rd wedding anniversary, George built her a special birdhouse shaped like a tiny chapel, painted white with delicate blue trim. Inside, he tucked a small note, "For all the years we've shared and all the ones still to come." Patricia wept when she read it. "George," she whispered, "you've given me more than I ever dreamed of." "And you," George replied softly, "have been my reason to keep going." George often reflected on how different retirement had turned out from what he'd once imagined. There were no endless days of golf or luxury cruises. Instead, there was work, sometimes hard, sometimes stressful, but always meaningful. There were new connections forged through shared struggles and triumphs. And there was love, deeper and stronger than ever, anchoring every step forward. As he approached 70, George began training Ethan to take over parts of the birdhouse business. His grandson, now in his 20s, had discovered a passion for woodworking, and together they dreamed up new designs. George felt a deep peace knowing that his craft, something born from necessity, would live on through the next generation. At the same time, Ethan helped George take his workshops online. Seniors from across the country could now attend virtual sessions, logging in from their living rooms to hear his lessons about earning with dignity and finding purpose in later life. Emails poured in from people he had never met, stories of retired teachers who had started tutoring businesses, of former factory workers who turned their gardens into produce stands, of grandparents who began selling handmade quilts online. Each message was a testament to the ripple effect of George's journey. One evening, as George read through those emails, Patricia leaned over his shoulder. "Look at all the lives you've touched," she said softly. "This is your legacy." George swallowed hard. "I never set out to leave a legacy," he said. "I just wanted to keep us afloat." "Sometimes," Patricia replied, "our greatest gifts come when we're simply trying to survive." Lying awake that night, George listened to the steady rhythm of Patricia's breathing and thought about the arc of his life. The terrified man at 62, the one who sat at the kitchen table surrounded by bills, felt like a distant memory. In his place was someone wiser, calmer, more resilient. He had learned that the true secret to earning after 60 wasn't just about money. Money paid the bills, but meaning lit the path forward. Life continued to test them. Another storm damaged the garage roof. Patricia's condition required adjustments to their daily routines. Some months the online store was quieter than others, but none of it felt insurmountable anymore. George had built more than income streams. He had built resilience, creativity, and a deep well of purpose that carried him through. By 70, he was no longer worried about retirement being the end. It had become, instead, a series of new beginnings. He saw aging not as a decline, but as an opportunity, a chance to embrace patience, perspective, and perseverance, qualities that only time could teach. On his 70th birthday, surrounded by children, grandchildren, friends, and former workshop attendees who now called themselves his students, George raised a glass and looked around the room. The laughter, the warmth, the shared stories, they were worth more than any paycheck. Later that night, he and Patricia sat on the porch, wrapped in a shared blanket, watching the fireflies dance in the warm summer air. "You know," George said softly, "I used to think my best years were behind me." Patricia rested her head on his shoulder. "And now?" "Now," he said with a smile, "I think the best years are the ones I'm living right now." Patricia squeezed his hand. "That's because you've stopped surviving, George, you're living." And she was right. Because in the twilight of his life, George Miller, once a frightened retiree staring at a stack of bills, had discovered something extraordinary. Retirement wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of an entirely new one, written not in fear or scarcity, but in resilience, love, creativity, and the unwavering belief that life at any age is always ready to be lived. "Now I feel alive, like I still have chapters left to write."